So,
how did it all start?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting us, and thank you everybody for being here. But how did it all start?
So it was January. It was actually a very nice January day. Elias and I were attending the annual Life Sciences conference in San Francisco, the JP Morgan conference, and we were having a coffee. Actually, I think we were discussing about doing a business thing together. But then we said, hang on a second, let's do something a little bit different, a little bit outside work. And Elias happens to be in Greece quite a bit. I happen not to be in Greece too much. So we thought, let's do something involving Greece because we both feel that there is something here. So this event was dreamt up, essentially just a few months ago out of a casual discussion, and both of our passion about life science and wanting to do something in relation to Greece. So.
Yeah. And it was one of those discussions where I think, unfortunately, Greeks have often lately, where we know there's great science in this country, we know there's great people in this country, but unfortunately we don't have the companies, or if you want, the applied science part is not where it should be, or at least in our minds where it should be, right? So we thought, hey, well, how about getting together, and I just had the idea about calling a MITF and Basilis, to get this going, right? So.
And as Greeks sometimes do when they get together, they there's a lot of talk but not much action. So but we did manage to happen, and thank you very much for all coming. And it got here in the end. So maybe without introducing ourselves too much, but we both have a long track record in life sciences. Elias mostly from the biotech side, and myself mostly from the medical device side. But we do feel both of us are joined by, a strong feeling that we are at the cusp of a big change in life sciences. So I think we both believe that we're living at a time where life sciences is transforming, not just from a scientific perspective, not just that technologies are maturing and are coming to the point where great things can come out of life sciences, but also a point where life sciences are entering our lives in a much more tangible way. They're more pervasive than they were in the past. And we wanted to bring a little bit of that spirit to the audience.
So maybe you want to take that slide?
Yeah, so just to kind of describe in a little bit more, a bit more granularly what I said earlier. And if we think of life sciences as three main areas, biopharma, medical devices, and digital health, each of these three areas is producing a significant amount of innovation these days. And we will see a little bit why, but there are some areas which are appearing now. There's convergence between those three, let's say, groups of life sciences, and there's some areas and there are new technologies that are emerging, which are quite groundbreaking. So it's a little bit in that spirit and a little bit that sort of transformation that we wanted to bring to the discussion today. So, for example, if you look at biopharma and medical devices, these are two in themselves big industries, having come from different sort of backgrounds. The biopharma being more driven by developments in genetics, developments in pharma drug discovery, medical devices originating originally from the use of implants and other type of devices. So more of a mechanical or electromechanical innovation. So we see these two worlds converging now to create areas which are today still under development. So, for example, you have the ability to have much more targeted, much more localized delivery of drugs, as in the case of oncology, where you can you're starting to have the move away from the systemic treatment into much more localized treatment. For example, in solid tumors, you have areas like interventional oncology, where you have the combination of devices that go into the body, obviously, and then into or close to tumors to either deliver energy or deliver drugs or deliver other sources of of maybe lights or other types of energy, and then in combination with drugs, create new types of therapies. So that's one area where we see, for example, a lot of this kind of big conversion happening. The other sort of new growing area is this area which is loosely called digital health. It goes by other words like connected health or sort of wellness and well-being. But digital health, defined as sort of anything that is essentially a device or kind of an innovative, medical instrument which is now connected to the digital world, to the cloud, and where data is becoming much more important. And again, you see there's an area where we live in a world where data, non-healthcare related. I mean, everyone has a smartphone. Everyone is now very sort of aware of their social networks. So we live in a world where data is becoming important in our lives anyway. So it's also reflected in healthcare. Data is becoming one of the big drivers of innovation in health. So digital health again is converging with medical devices. So you see, for example, the transformation happening. A lot of the implants are now starting to become much more intelligent. So let's take, for example, cardiovascular implants like stents or other devices that are now getting communication devices embedded in them. So you will be able to have stents and these type of implants that are able to transmit externally and transmit data as to their function, as to their their ability to perform and function properly. So it creates a new world of of innovation and a new sort of paradigm. Then you also have this kind of convergence of digital health and medical also enables new business models. So you start having the more efficient delivery of care, moving away from the traditional sort of setting in the outpatient or in the doctor's office, where until today the health is typically delivered. So for something not very serious, you go to your doctor, you have to book an appointment well in advance. You have to sit down. The doctor pulls out a stethoscope, looks at you and does a sort of typical physiological examination, and then based on the doctor's experience comes up with a set of recommendations. And obviously in a more serious setting, you're in a hospital setting, that's the case as well. Patient has to go to a hospital to get the healthcare delivered. Then once the healthcare is delivered, released from hospital, goes back back home. So digital health again transforming that way that healthcare is delivered in a more efficient way, either within the the developed world where you can have that delivered more effectively, or in the developing world where doctors and hospitals aren't as as widespread as they are in the Western world. And then finally, we also have the convergence of biopharma and digital health, again, where, for example, data is becoming very important. In for example, drug discovery, as Elias is going to describe in a few slides down, and genetics and gene sequencing is a very cumbersome. It's a very data intensive process. Again, the algorithms, the innovations in digital health are delivering significant advances in able to process that type of innovation. So we're going to be seeing again I wouldn't say shortcutting, but certainly the decreasing of the period of this discovery period, or the period of filtering out, let's say, what's kind of what works and what doesn't work, because a lot of the a lot today in drug development and biotech is about it's about taking trial and error and taking what's worked, what hasn't worked, trying it out. But a lot of that process can be shortcut with intelligent software, big data, and algorithms. So again, seeing the convergence. So before leaving the slide, just to say that there is innovation in all three areas: biopharma, medical devices, and digital health, which is driving not just those three areas, but also convergence in these. So maybe the next slide talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing in each of these areas and what we'll see a little bit more of as from now on. So maybe Elias on the Biopharma.
So I think what is interesting, and we hope that the audience is interested in doing the research that kind of are relevant to those areas. But from the biopharma perspective, I think one of the innovations that will be taking place or is taking place is people are moving towards therapy. As you know, most of the treatments still today are symptomatic. Some of them have a lot of side effects and problematic. But today we're at the cusp of actually seeing things like gene therapy or certain immunostrategies in oncology, which really take you one level down where exactly we want to be, which is a therapeutic intervention that goes after therapy, not just symptoms. And this is clearly important because that would take our industry to the totally next level, right? Because what you need to do, what you need to achieve when you're doing your research or when you're starting your company is to be having those things in mind. Now, personalized medicine is something that is definitely coming up, whether that is through biomarkers or through other strategies. That's definitely going to be a very, very strong trend, which we're seeing and we're going to continue to see. And that also connects to reimbursement. We won't be talking about reimbursement too much today, but I think that's something that people should keep in mind. Who is going to pay for what you're creating? Immuno-oncology and therapy I talked about, but also there's another concept which is very dear to my heart because I've been involved with a number of companies involved in that space, is a simple concept of biology is complex, disease is complex, but our drugs, at the vast majority of the drugs are not, right? Going after a single pathway or under a single gene, when you're talking about complexity, biological complexity is simply not enough. So today we now have new modalities where it is, combination therapy, even older drugs that you combine to achieve a much better result, or whether it is you have, polyspecific antibodies or what have you. These are really nice strategies where you can follow, and we will see more and more drugs following those paths down the road. And down the road means 5 to 10 years from now, right? And another clear trend, and you will see some more information on that further down, is orphan diseases and ultra-orphan diseases. There are many reasons, I think, why this has become more in vogue lately. Clearly people are paying more attention to those in need, but also there's other reasons why orphan diseases are becoming very, very interested. Today we saw some research connected to orphan disease, thalassemia, from actually this institute that we're seeing today, which is very, very interesting work. But this is something definitely that if you go out and you're thinking about your research, where should you focus, what should you do, how do you start a company, it's definitely something that you should be thinking about. Do you want to do medical devices?
Yeah, so similarly in medical devices, there is we see a number of significant trends, and again, I think it's important to put these in the context of why they're happening. The first, I think, is the cost pressure that we have from healthcare systems today. There's a significant need to reduce the cost. Healthcare is a big burden on most of the Western world's budgets, and therefore there's a very strong need to have much more effective delivery of healthcare, and medical devices have a role to play on that. So there is an emphasis on prevention over therapy, which, for example, in oncology and in cancer is very much the case. Prevention being much easier or early therapy or early treatment is much less costly than treatment after a disease has progressed. So there's very much emphasis on that. We see, therefore, again, the increased role of imaging in that case, because imaging, also bringing that down to the molecular level imaging and much more precise imaging is able to deliver that prevention much more specifically than it was in the past. Also, the assistance of robotics, or the growing use of robotics in healthcare. Robotics being, for example, used as assist devices for surgeons, or even doing some of the interventions on their own. We're going to see a growth, and we are seeing already a growth in that as robots are becoming more pervasive and cheaper. Clearly, there is a move towards minimally invasive, which also has a side effect of reducing hospital stay and trauma to the patient. And again, as I said, the big sort of driver is the aim to decrease the costs, the overall cost of treatment. And we're seeing now, especially in the US, there is a new sort of phenomenon, which is what's called outcomes-based care. So payers paying depending not just on the service provision, but on the outcome, on the successful outcome of that service provision. So that is a transformation in the way that even the payers and the insurance system sees healthcare. And digital health has a role to play there as well. You have, similar to the prevention, is an emphasis on well-being, so keeping people healthy before they go down the slippery slope towards the chronic diseases. It also helps empowering patients. So we're seeing a trend where in the past the center, as I said earlier, the center of care, the caregiver was the primary caregiver was the doctor, the GP. But now we're seeing the patients being much more empowered. I mean, clearly the power of the internet has revolutionized that. I mean, who in this room, hasn't had, some illness, some not feeling well? The first thing you do is you go and Google up your symptoms. I mean, I don't think I know anyone that doesn't do that. But and I'm sure there are some people that don't. But clearly, a lot of us do, and therefore there is certainly that. There are certain models that are being developed around that, bringing that sort of data, that power to the patients. There are new business models emerging. So, for example, not just in the way I mentioned earlier, how you go and how healthcare is delivered, but even in drug, I would say treating or taking part in clinical trials. There's a company which we funded in Europe, for example, called My Tomorrows, which revolutionizes the way that clinical trials take place. So, you can look up in their website. You can go and look up your condition, and you can find if there's a clinical trial that is aimed to test a new drug for that condition, and you can find that out. And these guys will put you in touch and bring you in touch with this trial. So essentially revolutionizing the way the trials and drugs are sort of meet patients. So new business models emerging by this new data-driven world that have the potential to really transform the way that we will be using and consuming and getting healthcare. So
okay. So the one thing and one main message I want to send out is there's definitely a positive environment about investment in life sciences today. There's a lot of money out there, especially in the United States, where people are willing to kind of put it to work. And but we want to show you a couple of slides here which explain a little bit more about that space, right? Because we felt that we needed to go with some kind of basic information to provide a kind of a framework. This is the first life science event we do here in Greece. So one trend we're seeing is that in the US, the financings, so the Series A is when the first time the company officially raises money from investors, are getting larger. So, we're lucky to have a couple of US investors here in the audience today that will tell you probably that there's a trend towards having Series A in the United States for close to $40 million, right? So first time you go out and raise money, $40 million. This is not the case in Europe, as you can see from this slide. Europe is always a little bit less. And that creates a problem. It creates a competition problem, right? Because this is a global market. You compete globally. Your competitor can be in Japan, in Boston, in San Francisco, it doesn't matter. But you need to compete with them. And you need to do a job better than them if you want to succeed. And you have less money. So this is a trend we're seeing. This is something that needs to be kept in mind. And what you see in the last column is that suddenly, in the last years, that gap has really, really gotten very big, right, between US financings and European financings, right?
And I think that's also quite telling, because Europe has always been a little bit the laggard of the US, but we're seeing now an increase. I mean, it follows a more general trend of how venture capital in Europe has developed versus the US. I mean, Europe has always been a little bit the sort of a 10-year follower or maybe 20-year follower of the US. The European venture capital industry itself only sort of generating and really starting to come into into its own since the 2000s, since the bubble of 2000s. So in the last 15 years, there's been a significant transformation. So there's quite a lot of catching up to do, but I would say that right now the European life sciences industry, the life sciences funding industry is a relatively mature industry, can fundraise on its own. There is a number of very established investors in the space. Still catching up to with the US, but at a good place.
So the other thing that is happening, which just kind of follows on what we just said, is that when you're trying to raise as a European company, and we assume that most people in this room will first start to think about establishing a company in Europe, whether it is in Greece or elsewhere. We definitely hope it's in Greece, but this is kind of the environment you need to live in, the ecosystem you need to live in. But what you're going to be facing is that when you talk to people here in Europe, they will tell you always that how are you going to deal about the fact that US VCs are pushing everything up, right? And that, believe me, is a significant issue when you're trying to develop a drug, right? Because when you have, let's say, 15 million to do a clinical trial, and the guy next to you has 30 million to do a clinical trial, or first of all, he might do 2 clinical trials, which increases his chances of success, or he can do a much better clinical trial than you, which means that the data he's going to produce is going to be easier to sell.
And I think that puts you at a disadvantage, right?
Absolutely. So another thing that I actually get a lot of questions on this, which is where do we see investments? So this is I try to use information, and Aris also, that are publicly available. There's the Bio organization, which is the large kind of organization of biotechnology, which is based in the US. You can find most of those slides on their website. They have 2 reports, and also I have to thank BioCentury, which allowed us to kind of use some of their slides from their analysis. But here on this slide, what you see is investments in different areas. Now, what is going to be interesting, we have actually Manos, they'd like to have Manos afterwards. He's going to be talking us a little bit about infectious diseases, which is the number 2 area, right, of investment. And what you see here is a total and clear win for oncology. Now, I'd like you to remember this because I'll show you some slides further down that go totally against this from kind of a logical perspective, and I think it's be good to kind of think about that a little bit more. Now, another element, what you see on this slide is the areas and the number of molecules in clinical development in the different stages of clinical development. So when you're coming and you're saying, you know what, I want to develop a drug in, let's say, cardiovascular, that's what kind of you have to be facing. Now, the other point, which is important on the slide, is what you see partnered and unpartnered. Now, that's a very important point because it shows you 2 things. It shows you if big pharma has already placed bets in that area, so is their pipeline full, which means that theoretically they won't be doing deals till that reads out. And also how much competition you have, either for financing or other competition around you for deal making. So these are things that you need to be aware of because these are things that venture capitalists and definitely anybody in the life sciences you're going to be talking to, that is involved and is a life science professional will be having those things in mind. I mean, right? Ari, isn't that what you look when a company comes and presents to you?
Absolutely, and I think the point is you have to select your market carefully. You have to select the area quite carefully. And I think sometimes it's always a bit scary if you're on your own. So if you're in an area where there isn't any other activity, it's a little bit lonely. So I think there's obviously two sides to it because one is it's much less crowded, but on the other hand, if you're on your own and nobody's investing there, then maybe there is a reason why. So we as investors, you always want to sort of be in an area where there's other interests as well. So you mentioned also an important point being the partnering, because seeing where pharma and large pharma interest lies, I think is very important, because large pharma for good or for bad is most likely going to end up being the acquirer of innovation, of your innovation. So seeing where their interests lie and what they're investing in themselves, where they see the life science, the specific area going, I think is quite important. So partnering and having an idea where the partners are is quite significant. Switching over to the medtech side, it's not the story is not as great. Medtech in Europe especially has been always a little bit the poor cousin of Biopharma. In the US, I think the medtech market for the fundraising market for medtech is a little bit healthier, but still, not in line, not as much with pharma. And I think there's a few reasons for that. I mean, the medtech industry has been dominated by 2 or 3, very large incumbent players. So it's a little bit of an oligopoly. So when it comes to having exits, what VC's success is driven by their successful exits, and therefore their ability to raise money and the funding rounds is driven by the success of those exits. Now, if you have an oligopoly and you have only 2 or 3 potential buyers for the company, that possibly means that the exit prices are not as high. So therefore, the fundraising environment for medtech has been a little bit tougher than for biopharma, both for the private rounds and IPOs. But I think that market is steady, and there are some of the big brand name VCs in the US and Europe have managed to raise their next funds and their serial funds. So I think the market is still healthy, but certainly not as big as a biopharma. And if we look at digital health, the story is quite different again. This is a relatively new area, so there's a big growth in investment in that space, and there is I would say it's a little bit early to see how this trend is going to continue, but since the last 2 or 3 years, there's been very strong growth. It's also hard to find very accurate numbers because digital health is a relatively new area. Plus, it's also not defined the same by the different people that you can get the data from. But if you basically segment it into personal health tools, or broadly life science technologies, or delivering care, the area of biggest growth is in the personal tools and tracking. So I would say the more the consumer side of digital health is what has seen the highest growth. So that's another sort of big area of innovation. Now again, I have to say that in Europe, strangely, digital health has not developed, has not flourished as much as the US. So most of the investment is in the US. There's a lot of funds in the US for digital health investments. In Europe, still much less. But I think this is probably going to change as again Europe matures in that respect too.
So the other thing is we hear a lot. People, to be honest, complaining, right? Oh, I cannot find money, I cannot do this, there's, nobody likes my idea, whatever. But the hard truth is that good science always gets investments. At the end of the day, if you have a really, really good scientific idea, it's going to get funding. And the reason is that people are actively looking for good scientific ideas. I personally have not seen a great scientific idea without having problems, for example, not having IP or whatever problems, not getting funded. You're going to find some way, either through academic funding, Horizon 2020, some kind of way of really funding your research. And one trend which is very, very interesting in Europe right now is how academic institutions are getting involved with the early finance. So one of the problems we had when we were starting companies is who's going to fund that area between, let's say, the discovery and the first clinical trial? Who's going to put the money there? Because that's the point of the highest risk. We're going to be talking about risk further down. And what you're seeing today in Europe is that academic institutions themselves are raising quite significant funds in order to go in and invest into companies. And that's a very, very interesting trend that we're seeing. Maybe I'll go direct to the next slide. Maybe
if I'll just add something on that, because and we'll talk a little bit about that more in the panels. But what we see a lot is the emergence in Europe we see of what's called the tech transfer entities. So some of the academic institutions a lot of them in Europe and in the US, are developing these, these units, these tech transfer units that basically take the, the IP that the universities develop, researchers develop, and transform them, take them out into the commercial.
I think we're getting a sign to go faster.
Okay, we will speed up. but there, yeah. So that's a kind of a, let's park the thought, and we will explore that in the panel.
So anyway, these are examples of funds that have been invested. I think you're going to be talking about that further down. I mean, clearly, the Oxford Life Science Innovation number is really impressive at over 400 million. Now, another thing is publish. Please publish, but be careful also if you know about your IP. As you know, under European law, if you publish, you might end up having serious trouble getting IP because of novelty and other reasons. But at the end of the day, one nice trend of understanding how cutting edge your science is to see if there's a surge of publications in the area you're in. Here, we're taking a CRISPR technology. This is actually data that you probably know. I think you're also using some of the CRISPR technology, right? And that's why I actually use this slide, because this is something that actually is used as a technology in this institution, has produced some publications from this institution, right? But you see that sudden surge, and that's actually what we see in biotech many times, right? When you see those sudden surge of publications in an area. Now, I'll just go a little bit quicker on the slides. One thing, though, is, and definitely we have an issue with that in Greece, is we don't have a biotech ecosystem. This is investments you have seen in Europe. And what you see is that more than 1/3 of the investment, that big circle on the upper right, is happening in the UK. And what you see, the other investments, the circle, the size of the circle shows you how much money has been invested, right? And you see that you do have a clear headway of the UK into investments. If I showed you the same slide in the United States, you would see two areas popping up, Boston, San Francisco, with San Diego in third place.
I'm going to risk the wrath of Katerina, but I'm going to say one thing on the ecosystem, because I think it's very important. The ecosystem concept is extremely important in life sciences, because you need a lot of pieces of the puzzle to work together to create a successful life sciences industry. You need the labs, you need innovation, you need the academia, you need the funding, you need everything that comes, the management, all the services that come around that. And so the ecosystem concept in biosciences, especially, I think, is quite fundamental. So that's why the UK has, and the UK government has actually prioritized life sciences as one of their, and especially not just the government, but the local governments. London has prioritized life sciences as one of its biggest, biggest drivers of innovation. So I think it's important. The importance of the ecosystem is quite important in life sciences. So
I'm not going to do a Brexit joke.
So
the other thing is about risk. I think we're going to go quickly through those slides. I'm sorry for that, but one thing you have to always remember is that when people invest the money into a company, they understand the risk. And also you as entrepreneurs or as scientists or whatever, you need to understand what kind of risk people are playing with. Essentially what this slide is showing you is that if you have a molecule, that assume it's the most wonderful molecule that you can think of from a scientific perspective, kind of grosso modo, the chances of reaching the market is below 10%. Okay, so essentially what we're saying is that you have 10 molecules, pretty much one will reach the market. Now, then if you start analyzing the data a bit more, what you see is that success rates between indications really vary. And remember I showed you the slides before about oncology having the most investments? Look where oncology is on this slide. Right? So although the success rates of oncology are so low, people are continually piling 1/4 of the money that goes into it into oncology. Obviously, because of the need, right? So when you look at things, you have to look at the whole Gestalt, as the Germans say, and before understanding where you need to go and how things are going to play over. This is from phase 1 data. Now, this slide shows you the difference between oncology and non-oncology products. And what is interesting to see here is that usually what one would assume is that as you go across your clinical development from phase 1 to phase 2, phase 3, things would move to a kind of the same direction, right? The closer you get to approval, the higher chances of success. as you see, if you look only at the last line, the NBA BLA approval, that's the only place where those two lines are close enough if you exclude the first stage of development, which has nothing to do with efficacy, has only to do with safety, right? So it's just always something to remember, risk and how you go across your clinical development and the concept of risk. Now, if you look at oncology in general, you can do that in every disease. I just picked up oncology because it was, if you want, the easiest one with the most data. You will see that even within oncology, it's not the same thing. You have major differences even within that indication called oncology. That goes a little bit back to Aisha's comment about digital health, the other areas. It depends how you define things and how the numbers are going to look at, right? There is a clear reason why hematological cancers are seeing a lot of investment, right? People think that they have a higher chance of success in an area where there's clear need. You want to comment on that, or? Okay. So, last slide on this series is biomarkers. If you're doing research on biomarkers, we saw one presentation today. I know there's a couple of other companies doing research on that in Greece. Very important for our industry today. Multiple reasons for personalized medicine, but one other reason, which we don't think enough of, is it increases your chances of success. And every time you do something that increases your chances of success, people will like it. That was kind of my comment to you at, you remember when we were talking before. So this is something that I believe it's a nice area, and also at the first stages, biomarkers do not need the level of investment that other areas need. Now, rare diseases, I'll fly over the slide, great increase of interest. One reason, very clearly, has higher chances of success, right? I mean, people are, there's a very logical way of why people go after certain areas over and above the amazing medical need for these people. I mean, it's unbelievable, right? We're talking very few patients, and if you don't do something, these people don't have a hope. Very important area. So maybe this is, our conclusion slide. You want to start with that?
Yeah, I think we try to give you. It's a little bit hard in 20 minutes to give you a full view, but we try to give you a glimpse on why we think life sciences today are at its turning point. I mean, there's clearly innovation, significant innovation, and significant technology change has developed this turning point that's led us to this turning point. We understand, biology, human biology, and our own nature and the nature of diseases much better. We have tools at our disposal that we didn't have even a few years ago. There's the convergence of technologies I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and we have this increased awareness of public awareness of health and the need for reducing costs in the healthcare system. So this creates an environment where there drives innovation. It then brings funding into this area, which creates even more innovation, and that I think we are literally at this turning point. We have significant challenges to address still, so it's clearly not an easy road, as we said. So there is the increasing complexity of technologies. We have a big financial burden to the health system that needs to be reduced. Healthcare is still for the only very few and the fortunate. So, for example, in the developed world, it's mostly the case. And yes, I'm being asked to stop. and there is also some important ethical issues to consider. However, good models will always find funding, and good research will always find its way. As Elias said, there's a number of financing sources. So, we hope we give you a bit of a glimpse of this world that is emerging, and through the panels, we'll talk about this a little bit further. So, I will leave it now to Elias and invite our first panelist.